Six Nations Misagi Kandinjba. Just going over for anybody who hasn't already heard and has been following us in the sessions. I basically introduced myself. My traditional name is Mashkakenebe Kwe, and translates to Medicine Water Woman. And I'm Turtle Clan, identify as both Ongwahoe as well as Anishinaabe, particularly and specifically Genegeha as well as Ojibwe Mississaugas. Yeah, so today I was spending some time kind of going over, what we wanted to cover in this section and starting to lead us into moving into the ideation phases and sessions, if that's something that you're going to be following us along with. And as we've been moving along, really getting an understanding and how we're going to be doing the live painting, the installation work on site at Gibson House. And I was very much, and just to lay the groundwork for the framework of this project as well, right from the beginning, I was very, very purposeful and specific in not wanting to approach it with a 100% finalized concept, predominantly because the things that we've been talking about, they're very much fluid in nature. It's a learning process. It's a process. So with that in mind, I didn't want to be too rigid on what the eventual end product was going to be. However, as time has gone on and we've moved on in these sessions, I've started to get a better picture and handle on kind of what that imagery is going to look like, which we will be going over in the ideation sessions, and then getting some community input on how they want to be a part of it. But there's an idea I have in terms of being able to incorporate everybody's voices. So tonight is really about looking at my practice, but also different ways of storytelling, the usage of symbolism, and how that kind of connects to speaking of connection to spirit. We've been talking a lot about that in these sessions, but also how that all connects to how we relate with the land and the surroundings that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to share my screen.
Lucy, before I forget, because I forgot, I just want to offer you this medicine. I made a big one today, just like because this is the last session.
Oh, yeah.
I just want to offer you this tobacco for the time that you're spending with all of us. And I was hoping to give you this tobacco in person when we see each other.
Yes, yes, great.
Okay, so I'll keep this one for when we see each other.
Perfect. Which will be right around the corner.
Yes.
Next weekend. It's crazy.
Correct, yes.
That we're already there. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. And I'm also turning my video off just to make sure that you guys can see the actual presentation, because sometimes my internet doesn't help that situation. Can I get a thumbs up or let me know that you can see it?
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. Okay, so as was mentioned, we're going to talk about a lot of different things, but predominantly what we're going to focus on tonight is Indigenous visual language, what that means, and how it relates to connection. And I also wanted to take a note that this session tonight may actually be a bit shorter just because it's pretty direct information, but I will leave time at the end for any questions. So one of the pieces that I always want to start off with, especially when we're starting to move into now the collaborative phase of this project, where we heard a lot of different perspectives, we heard a lot of really good foundational knowledge around Indigenous ways of knowing. We've heard a little bit of a history, and now we're moving into that space of really having an opportunity to truly collaborate and to truly put a message out there that is in the spirit of reconciliation, but also specifically pointing to some of the teachings that we've received along the way, and really starting to reflect on what that means to us. How would we want to articulate that? And also by that, also showing and sharing with the participants here, what are some of the ways that Indigenous artists have been, doing this work in the past. So I always start these sessions with a recognition of honoring one another in this process, recognizing that when we move into these spaces, we have a really great opportunity to tell stories and share different points of view, and also recognizing that there's no viewpoint, there's no perspective that is better than another. As long as, again, coming with a good intention, like I mentioned when we first launched this opening of the series at the iTalks, and then as we're moving through this process, really recognizing and honoring one another's experience of the land base, because every single one of them is valid. And then as we're moving in collaborative space, and as I'm sharing some of the perspectives of how Indigenous artists interpret this knowledge, I think one of the pieces that's really important as well is to recognize that the processes that we undertake and the spaces that we create in the area of reconciliation really, again, it's important to highlight that we're doing this from a place of exchange and not cultural appropriation. Because again, cultural appropriation, it can mean a lot of different things, but in the context of art making, what happens sometimes is, it's not to say that the stories that were shared and individuals' understanding of connection to spirit and all of these really beautiful teachings and things that were shared doesn't mean that they're that they're not wonderful. They definitely are wonderful. But I think what we do those stories justice when we honor the path of that person or that individual has taken to be able to get that knowledge and to reclaim it, because essentially that's what's happening within Indigenous communities is a reclamation process of identity, of language, of ceremony, and of art. So we really want to be sure that we're not, we're minding and really caretaking that relationship and those boundaries that we talk about. And that can be seen. That's why I have the 2 row here as a reminder, that we can experience things together and share. However, we're not to be telling each other stories. And that's what's really beautiful about these types of projects. That's why I'm very passionate about these projects, is it's bringing together collective voices in this space of exchange, and not appropriating or not assuming to tell another's stories. And that goes for us as well, right? So to start out, what makes Indigenous art so special and different? And one of the pieces around this is that now, and that's not necessarily, inherent in there's all different types of forms of Indigenous art. But what I'm going to be showing you again is kind of sharing a bit of where I'm rooted within in terms of my practice and my approach, especially to these projects, and where that kind of comes from. And you'll see throughout this presentation kind of where I'm coming from, and hopefully that will help in helping people, move into that ideation phase of what is it that they can bring to the table in terms of voicing and representing their experience through this process. And so essentially one of the key components that I've always found, throughout my time as an artist and studying art, is this fact that many, if not all, Indigenous art has a very specific component of basically being a visual storyteller, and that there's usually a lot of symbolism embedded in it. Now that can be it's a spectrum, right? So we have some very predominant artists that are very overt. For example, Kent Monkman would be an example of this. If you haven't seen Kent Monkman's work, their work's incredible. And but again, that's a very stark difference to some of the founders of Indigenous art movements, which we'll talk about in this session. So it really is just recognizing there's a range of things, but really storytelling is always at the core of all of these different approaches to art making and visual storytelling. And if you look at the roots of Indigenous visual storytelling and visual arts, a lot of it is very much rooted in the aspect of storytelling and in connection to ceremony, as well as historical teachings, different parts around history being handed down through ancestral knowledge and vision. That can be seen as well, which we're going to look into, which is, as even as far back as petroglyphs that were kind of like the pictographs that kind of originated the form of Indigenous art. Another part is that it's always been informed by the natural world, and that's very natural in terms of, if you think about, again, as we talked over this series, is that inherent connection to land, being really in touch and having to be in touch with the surroundings, especially for survival. Our survival depended on it. So naturally, there's a very close connection to being inspired by the natural world and being inspired by that relationship. In most nations, it also became the foundation of how we recorded our history and our communal laws, which I'll go into a little bit here. We did talk a bit about that in terms of our treaty talks. If you haven't seen that, please do go back to the North York Arts YouTube channel, and you can be able to take a look at that and do some of the deep dives and with Jason Mercady, who kind of talked a little bit about that. So just to frame it, I, as an Indigenous artist, because as Anishinaabe as well as Ohlone, being of mixed ancestry with many nations attached to that, what I can speak to is that experience and that history. And I'm also very careful about that as well. I would never claim to speak for, like Cree art history, for example, or Inuit art history, because that's not my background. Not that I don't have knowledge on it, but that's just, again, that's adding to that piece of the appropriation, because appropriation can actually occur within our own nations as well. So I just want to make that clear for everybody that I'm really speaking from the rooted in the perspectives of things that I've had my own experience with and have my own teachings attached to, and are kind of developed over time, of myself being able to, and being very grateful and appreciative to have sat with other Indigenous artists, healers, and elders. So what I'm going to dive into first is a bit of kind of where the symbolism lies within the Anishinaabe, and the Anishinaabe being comprised of the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Odawa. In certain areas, there's some convergence of nations, such as the Oji-Cree and then also Algonquin. And of course, there's many, many more, as we've known over this series, that Indigenous nations are vast and also just as complex. But I'm going to just focus a little bit on here. What I've actually put up here on the screen is a basically traditional wear, would be used in either, some of you may know, in terms of powwow dance, but also ceremonial, any type of event where we are showing up for spirit, essentially, right? These are the kinds of pieces that would be worn, and actually are starting to have a revival in a contemporary context today. I'm also a beater, so that's another part of it as well, that is something that I could do a whole other session on, talking about the evolution of beadwork over time, from its historical stances and then its historical origins, now to really being a predominant part of pop culture, which is really exciting. So that's a whole, that maybe we can do that in the future. But this essentially it really shows, again, that connection to the natural world. You'll see a lot of floral designs in many, many, many nations because, again, that is that reference to the natural world. It's what's kind of in front of us. And as many people know about, artistry generally, artists generally tend to be influenced by their surroundings, inspired by life. So that is something that you'll see a lot of, is this very distinctive style of florals. And even if you get into that as well, again, can carry its own session on, different floral types for different land bases. And then you could also actually, what's really amazing about this is, I have a funny story about when I first went to Toronto for school. It was my first year at OCAD University, and I was on a streetcar, and I had a beaded bret in my hair, and it just shows you how these symbols and these iconography has carried over time as identifiers that helped us to identify, what nation you were from or what land base you were from, just in a visual sense without even having to speak words, or to greet each other. So I was on the streetcar, and this gentleman, one of the community members that I had, didn't know anybody in Toronto at the time. He was able to get from my beadwork that I was Ganegeha, that I was Mohawk, and that I was a particular clan because it was a turtle. And he, so he had all this information, and he basically greeted me, in the language. I did, I know more now, but at the time I didn't. But that's just really one of those things where, and of course it made me feel very welcomed, right? Because, being in a big metropolitan with a lot of people, it can be very, can feel isolating. But in that little moment, I was able to have a connection with a fellow community member, with a brother, right? A community brother. And, really feel at home and also feel seen and recognized. And all just from something as simple as a bret, right? As something as a beaded adornment. So that's what I want to really help people understand, that these symbols, they carry such a rich history with every single one, even having, different stories attached to it, carried up over time. Whoops. So one of the predominant pieces that you'll see a lot within, and again, we're talking about a historical context of, where the symbolism kind of started from. Within a lot of Anishinaabe nations, and then we talked a little bit about this when we were doing our treaty talks around wampum, which we'll talk about in this as well, because it's a piece of symbolism in itself as well that contributes to this history and this evolution of symbolism. But one of the founding pieces, in contrast and similarity to birch, for the Anishinaabe, as well as many other things, but I'm just kind of focusing on one piece here. So the birch, I just have a few things here that talk about, the significance of it, and, how there's deep symbolism in terms of connecting some of the stories. We're not going to go into the teachings of the stories because, again, that takes a long, long time. And different nations, even different nations within the Anishinaabe peoples, will have different stories that are attached to it. And again, that just goes to show the diversity even within similar nations and in terms of land base. But the birch in particular, we see ends up getting used as birch scrolls. So this is a birch scroll from the Chippewa Nation from 1860. And this, essentially, you can kind of see that there's some little etchings on here. And then when you zoom in, and a lot of these are now in museums, right? In art, or in anthropological spaces, and are being, kept in terms of preserved. But what these actually tell are particular, ceremonial protocol and practices, or either talking about a particular point in history that was really significant to that nation, or talking about specifically our prophecies. And prophecies were pieces of information that were told to us in terms of direction of how we were going to be walking our paths moving into the future. And I would argue that almost every single nation has some type of prophecies attached to it. And in many of them, which is extremely interesting if you're ever interested in diving into that, many of the prophecies actually prophesize these times that we're in now. So it's a really, really interesting, piece of information that's kind of been carried through in terms of tradition in our communities. But the birch scroll essentially started, again, it's a document of history. However, within it also is layered with a lot of symbolism. So here I have an example. You can kind of see some of the etching that's in the birch scrolls, and this is another sample. And on the side here is breaking down some of the symbolism. So you can kind of see this round circular imagery, and this is translated loosely. And again, it's also always recognizing that nation to nation it's going to be different. This is a broad scope of Anishinaabe symbolism. But essentially this kind of representing Gitche Menando, Big Spirit. So when we were having our session with Raiden and Cloud talking about, they talked a lot about that connection to creation, connection to all my relations, right? Connection to all things. That's basically what this symbol kind of is talking about. And then we also have different things within different stories that are attached to the Thunderbird, which is also here, and that's embedded in some of these birch drawings or birch. Even in some nations, they would do birch biting, which is like a whole other kind of evolved symbolism over time. But again, it's talking about particular points in history. And then we have here on the side is kind of the beginnings of starting to understand, the different, trying to make sense of the surroundings, right? And the experiences that nations were having, recognizing and understanding that there was something greater, that there was bigger spirits abound, but then also we have, our physical earthly experiences that, that was basically being tried to, basically trying to represent that to be able to remember. And again, this also goes back to a lot of the sessions we've had previously talking about, all of these pieces existing as tools to remember. And that's really important to keep in mind as we go through this session, because that's going to lead us into the ideation sessions. And here we have a sample of the petroglyphs. If you ever get a chance to go out to Peterborough, Ontario, you can go and take a look at some of these that are maintained. They're still there. You can actually go and spend some time with these, but these are super, super ancient drawings that kind of talk about different points in time and history, and as well as that experience I was just talking about. And then you start to see a more of a refined sense of like very particular types of symbolism. So you'll see now this kind of forming as a very broad understanding of spirit on earth as well as within creation itself. We also start to see different separations, very simple but very complex symbolism around recognizing, the earthly plane and the spirit plane. Earth's surface, starting to look at how to identify trees, all just by shifting one particular notch or one particular line. So you're going to see the line is extremely important in the root of Indigenous art. And then you have here about and also talking about water. There's a whole other section that talks about just water symbolism. So I've included in here, now we're getting into a more, again, as time is moving on, more complex line work and symbolism to be able to show kind of the order and making sense of our surroundings. Again, looking at that big spirit, Gitche Menando coming down, the Raiden and Grey Cloud talked about the four beings, the wind, the water, the fire, and the earth. So in here, this is basically kind of talking about those four. So you can see the four prongs there. And then that moving outward and kind of showing where they kind of govern and where they support and kind of where they reside in terms of the structure. And again, this isn't necessarily about a hierarchy, it's more about an order, right? Around remembering and helping us remember our responsibilities and our roles within this whole system. You go down a little bit further, and then you see, people, and then what is their kind of responsibility. You have the animals that came first, and I know Grey Cloud and Raiden talked a little bit about that. And then also, where we kind of are situated and our responsibilities to nations, our responsibilities to maintaining balance, our responsibilities of stewarding the land is all embedded in very simple yet effective and detailed line work. And so you can kind of see a bit of the other pieces on the side as they've evolved over time. And again, this is kind of going back into and breaking down some of the line work, but also some of the beadwork, and that starts to get translated into our adornments. So say, for example, myself, I had given you an intro when I did my first session, really breaking down the phonetics of my name and really helping you understand, what kind of responsibilities what kind of information is in my name and where I come from, my greeting, right? And our adornments would do the same thing, like I mentioned earlier with that story. So, for example, and again, it was a great example of, a contemporary, um, mode of being able to be seen in the world, still seen and utilized today, which I think is absolutely beautiful. But, back in the day, this would be, full adornment, you would really know. And in some cases, depending on what people were wearing, you would actually recognize if they were, a particular kind of leader in their community, if they had, made particular kinds of milestones, like all these different pieces, right, are just super inlaid in that symbolism that is simple yet super complex. So now moving into Haudenosaunee. So the Haudenosaunee is comprised of the Mohawk, the Cayuga, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, with the Tuscarora adopted in to the Five Nations, which making the six. This is a traditional outfit that one would normally wear to ceremony, and today actually is still worn in particular circumstances and occasions. When attending longhouse, for example, or attending, other something similar. But essentially, again, laid with, so many layers of symbolism and recognizing, where the nations, again, too, with the beadwork and the symbolism, just as much as like changing a tiny little thing, one element of it will be pointing to a particular nation and where you kind of your land base and where you kind of come from. And what was really interesting, so if you look at this, you'll see on the bottom of the skirt there's a dome structure. So that's one of the very I guess defining ways you can kind of select Haudenosaunee beadwork or Haudenosaunee symbolism is the usage of the dome. And the dome in particular is talking about that recognition again of, so you saw the circular imagery, circular symbol with the Anishinaabe talking about spirit, right? But this is talking about spirit as well, just in a different way, but talking about the same thing. So this is kind of showing, different parts of, our earthly walk, but then also how we relate to sky world. So in the Anishinaabe language and like different circles, most often people are talking about creation. In the Haudenosaunee perspective, when you're talking about sky world, that's kind of what you're talking about, is where creator lives, where creator's home is. And in essence, if you look at the creation stories, is where we all come from. Again, I talked a little bit in the beginning session about, Anishinaabe being lowered down, Ongohowe, the original people. So it's talking about that and remembering that relationship when in essence, you could argue is one of the first treaties we ever have, is when we agree to come and to steward and to be here and live in and walk with our responsibilities. So here you can see how it grows over time. The beadwork starts to get a lot more intricate, a lot more design based. And you see here this little symbol that looks like a little kind of swiggly, like little line on top. That's basically in reference to the creation stories of the tree. There's a tree that's involved in the creation stories. Again, I'm not going to go into too much around the creation stories. If you are interested, there's a lot of really amazing storytellers that have been actually documenting that recital and have it online now as a resource. So if you're interested, you can literally just Google like Haudenosaunee creation stories and you'll be able to see what has been accepted to share with everybody. because again, a lot of these stories are very much reserved to the community. I know the recital for the creation stories within the Haudenosaunee, the Ohlone people, can take up to, a week in ceremony. So, it's a very lengthy process, and it's something that we hold within our communities for, obvious reasons. But that's not to say that things aren't being shared so that everybody can kind of understand, again, exactly what we're doing here in recognizing our responsibilities and then moving forward in a collaborative space. So, and the difference as well in beadwork, even between the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee people, the Ohlone people, tend to have a type of technique that's a raised beadwork. One way, even just the beadwork, the material manipulation, along with the symbolism, can give you so much information into that person's nation location and again their responsibilities and connection to the land base. So as we mentioned, we talked a bit about this in some of the treaty talks, but I'm going to go into a bit more detail here. And I know I talked about it in the beginning as well, the opening session. But again, you see that evolution carry into, like I mentioned, if there was an equivalent to birch scrolls, it would be similarly like this, the wampum, that's kind of held with the Ohlone people. And we see the two predominant, one that you're probably really well acquainted with, as the Gaswintha, the two-row wampum from 1613, which was again, forged in a sense of understanding, boundaries essentially, how to successfully live collaboratively, and kind of again unifying in a goal moving forward. And again, like I mentioned in those sessions, these symbols, these tools, they're so much more than just that, right? There's a whole craftsmanship and artistry that goes behind this. But I really am always in awe the more, even though I've done for example, this presentation in different areas, different ways, but I've done it over and over and over again over my career. And every time I talk about it, I always remember, it helps me to remember, but it also is like, I'm always just impressed, right? And really blown away by the ingenuity and just the complexity but yet understanding and being able to translate that into like a simple, beautiful representation of what that is in terms of a symbol. So that's always blows my mind when I skip time to sit with them and look at them and remember that so much with just a little bit or just enough. And then on the side here we have the Hiawatha Confederacy belt, which is basically showing the treaty essentially and the relationship that's been made between the five nations. Now, of course. But basically recognizing and remembering, our connection to the Great Law and to the Code of Handsome Lake and all of those rules, rights, responsibilities that we have to one another in terms of nations, but also in terms of the land bases. And remembering too that every single bead, every single line has a significance and has a meaning, with dedicated people within our communities that their role and their job is just that, just to remember the stories that are attached to every single piece of this very simple, very complex symbol. And I did that. This kind of shows you like what's what in the Confederacy belt there. So it shows kind of, again, gives you a hint into the roles and responsibilities of each nation and each people within that nation. So eventually it started to evolve, and then we start to move into an area that myself as an artist have always been very, very influenced by. I remember being able to see some of this work when I was really young and feeling automatically connected to it, almost kind of like I'd seen it before, right? And again, as we move through these sessions, we're talking about memory, we're talking about ancestral memory and connection to spirit. So there's definitely something there, at least for myself, in terms of being able to discover a mode or a method of this evolution of symbolism that's rooted in so much history, and really important iconography for nations, that really spoke to what it was I was experiencing, and it just made sense, right? It was just such a natural way to, and a natural pathway to kind of walk down and start studying, getting a better understanding of. So, um, one now we move into a bit more of a kind of the founding of a developed style that was rooted in some of that symbolism. And we see that with the introduction of Norval Morrisseau, particularly leading the what they would call now, it depends on who you talk to, but the Woodland School or the Woodland style, which is predominantly Anishinaabe, and basically coming from, you know, all around the Great Lakes. But essentially what Norval Morrisseau was doing was you know, being able to be that history keeper through storytelling, through visual storytelling, so that these stories didn't die off, that we were able to maintain them somehow and maintain that understanding of connection. And, you know, of course, if you look at the history of symbolism within Indigenous nations, we've always been visual people. So it's a very natural and integral part to our reconnection even now. And so I always, you know, even myself, I'm very happy that so many more youth are now getting back into creating. Because like even when I was in, you know, I'm not necessarily super young anymore. But when I was a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed artist, there wasn't many people yet on the scene that were really like reclaiming those spaces and create and moving them into something new, right? So that's definitely been a recent piece, probably over the last 10 years, of artists that have come out, which I'm going to show you some really exciting ways that it's kind of this foundation is being interpreted and utilized moving forward. But essentially here you can see two paintings I chose, The Dreamer and The Birds with Hearts. And the reason why I wanted to highlight these in particular is to really pull attention to the spirit and the line work, spirit lines. And they can kind of see this like through this kind of X-ray vision approach that kind of shows the internal just like mechanism of the being. But essentially what that is that's a recognition of all of us having a spirit, right? As very much in line with what Raiden and Grey Cloud were talking about, was about this understanding that we're all connected by spirit, that because we all are, and we're always connected to creation. So this is something that you kind of see laid, you know, throughout Norval Morrisseau's work, is this line work, and very distinctively. And as time has gone on, a lot of people are kind of picking that tradition back up and contemporizing it, which is super exciting. And then also, you know, there's a lot of smaller things here too, talking about time and space, playing with those kinds of elements of how to actually visually, you know, represent some of these really complex teachings and prophecies that we have in our oral traditions, to be basically to help aid that teaching process. That's kind of how I see Indigenous art as well, as it's a teaching tool. You know, we are essentially, you know, aids to storytellers. And then I also, as you know, again, and I'm very fortunate, and I never take that part for granted, of being able to actually essentially sound spirit in on the earth through visual medium. So it's a very, very near and dear process to me. But it's something I take very seriously, and that's, you know, it's you see that again too as younger artists. They have a different approach, but it's all kind of really rooted in the same place. Just will be a different, you know, an altered interpretation. So with that being said, I wanted to share some younger artists, younger Indigenous artists that are really starting to take that line work, that visual representation of spirit to the next level, really, right? And starting to really play with what that looks like in terms of new visions that are coming around, right? What kind of we're moving into in the future. So I wanted to share Quill, Violet Christy Peters. You can follow her at Runchiquay. She's Anishinaabe. She's Thunder Bay located. And I've always just really been an admirer of her work, and she has a series out right now that she's been working on. She's a young mom, and she has some new work that came out that was talking about that recognition and that process of becoming a life, really moving into that space of being a life giver and understanding what those responsibilities are. They're absolutely gorgeous and just beautiful and touching. But I wanted to bring this up just to show you that this is a way that things are being interpreted, still rooted in history, still rooted in those original ways of understanding the world around us, from those pictographs, right? From the very really traditional core symbols that are latent within our nations, and how that's kind of translating to now. And you can even see here, even in this circular area here at the top, within creation from 2016, again, talking about creation, right? Like that big space. And what I love about these two is it's almost like the way I see it, right? Again, art is I almost see it as this painting on the right. I imagine it as myself, because she's such a great storyteller. I imagine that even as like that's what's out there, like the different perspective, right, of the same thing or of a similar thing. So I just really love Quill's work, and that just shows you, how things are being interpreted now from some young artists that are working now. And then we move into Victoria E. Ransom. Again, just really gets me pumped up because I just absolutely love, there's that reference to the traditional, reference to, the way we traditionally understood through symbols, our place within creation, but then just taken to a whole other contemporary level, right, of interpretation. And it's just so exciting. And even inferring into and referencing, some pieces that our ancestors didn't have, like, for example, the Diva Cup. Like, and there's even so many stories that are laid within, menstruation and women's teachings and the moon and all of these pieces and the thunder beings. Like, it's really, the work that's coming out from young artists is just extremely exciting to me. It just really inspires me. But Victoria is a Haudenosaunee, and you can follow her at these are ink drawings from some of her work over the past years. Again, just shows you again that usage of the dome, the traditional symbol around the recognition of Earthwalk and Skyworld, but just taken up to a different level, right? And it's kind of, I just want people to understand that there's different ways that we can kind of look at and really move and expand these teachings and these symbols. And then, of course, I put some of my own things here just to show, again, a different perspective and usage of different mediums. When I first started out my practice, I was very much rooted. I actually started out as an oil painter, doing a lot of basically like indigenizing the group of seven. And then there was a whole bunch of like, basically like a political take on art practices and art spaces and those kinds of things when I was much younger. But then eventually evolving into, as I started to take a look at, doing some of this research and really starting to sit with some of those original symbols, of this, like, how do we translate that and bring it into a contemporary lens? Like, how do those symbols translate what we go through today, but yet still reference history? And if you want to follow me, that's my handle for Instagram there, Mashkika Water. As I mentioned, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe. And the three sisters, this is an up-close picture, an up-close snap of the LRT public art installation center panel that I did for the region of Waterloo in 2018. And then my most recent painting, Consoled by Creation, 2022, which is essentially talking about moving through the grieving process, being aided by the connection to creation and maintaining connection and having that relationship with spirit. But as you can see, like in my work, I hope this helps people understand too, and try to visualize what the final product of this piece is going to look like. and it's going to have these elements infused in it, and that's something that I've been able to adapt over time. I really credit my work that I was able to do and humbled to do, to be a part of leading Indigenous youth artists crews in the city of Toronto, doing a lot of street art. So that's where I started to pick up aerosol, graffiti markers, paint markers. Really predominantly started using acrylics. So really starting to translate and utilize that into my practice. And what I found was aerosol in particular really lent itself to my understanding of what creation looks like, right? Like the home of creation, kind of where we come from. And that being, that outer space, that ethereal atmosphere. And oftentimes it's difficult to try to paint that. But I found with aerosol, I was able to actually translate that really well. So when I found that, it's something that I just constantly use all the time because it's the best way to depict it in a contemporary sense. And you can see within my work too that, of course, there's a lot of the spirit orbs, right? I utilize a lot of that to recognize, spirit in all things, understanding that. And then, of course, the spirit line work is really laid within it. And then also really from a more abstract perspective and usage of line. And it also is, again, referencing back to the Woodland School, obviously founded by Norval Morrisseau, but I also wanted to make mention of an individual that I was very fortunate enough to have spent time with her while she was still with us on the earth, which is Daphne Ojig. Daphne Ojig is, I find, not necessarily talked too much about in terms of relationship to the Woodland School. But if you ever get a chance to look at Daphne's work, I kind of look at Daphne's work and influence kind of in line and in parallel to Norval, in the sense that's the feminine perspective, right, of talking about the same thing or similar things. And she's also, a really big influencer in the woodland movement. And she was just a wonderful lady. She was the sweetest lady. And unfortunately, she's passed away now, but her work is amazing if you ever get a chance and you want to take a look at that. So I'm deeply influenced by both Norval, but also by Daphne in terms of, even just topic of how she looked at the world and, the comments that she was making about her community and her connection or disconnection. So yeah, that's basically, it's really cut and dry and it's pretty simple. When we're moving into the ideation sessions, I really just wanted to use this session to be able to give people a context of kind of where the work's rooted in, what it may look like. In our ideation sessions, I'm going to be sharing some draft concepts that I've been kind of sketching up as we've been moving through these sessions, and kind of where I envision getting the community input. And so again, referencing, it's not necessarily about and showing you these things to get you to copy. It's more just so that you can have an understanding of, how would your design, how would that voice be contributed to and collaborated with some of those themes. And again, really starting to get people to think about, things can be multi-layered, concepts can be very deep, but yet at the same time, very simple. And that's something that I'm hoping that we can achieve in the ideation sessions. So Miigwech, now if you have any questions, then I'll open it up for everybody.
Thank you so much, Lindsay, for sharing. Thank you so much. Anybody, feel free, please. Otherwise, I will take over. No, I'm just kidding. Hey, do you have any questions? So Lindsay, while people start thinking about the questions that they're going to ask you, what can people expect on Saturday and Sunday, June 11 and 12 at Gibson House?
Sure. So what you can expect is, I'm planning to roll up early and be there early and on site, because what I try to do in these types of sessions is just to make sure that we can dedicate as much time to helping people contribute in whatever way they want to, right? And again, the ideation sessions are really mainly going to be to help people flesh out ideas and for them to see the concept, and kind of see how they would fit that in the final piece. But the day of, like, it's literally going to be, you'll be able to see me throw up some aerosol background, be able to lay out the composition of the piece, and then also support in the production and painting of it, right? I have a helper who's coming in. They've done a lot of work in the past assisting me, Caitlin Farrar, and they're an artist as well. And so there's going to be help there. We're also going to have help from Schuyler, I understand, which was the youth mentee in the program, which is a really, I feel, invaluable perspective to lend not only to supporting the participants, but also to the composition of the actual piece, having had experience in spending time in the land base of North York, and being able to contribute in that way. So, and then of course, like, you'll have opportunities to, if you wanted to have further discussions of some of the things that we talked about over the series, over the iTalk series. That's a great opportunity to do so because I'm going to be there and we'll be in person. So, these sessions are really great, but at the same time, there's something to be said about the in-person, right? And the energy that kind of is flowing within that. And that's why, have kind of brought on help to be able to interact with the community in that way, should anybody want to. But it's going to be lots of fun. And you'll get to see what I really love about doing that is I think that in my experience, I always really enjoy seeing, and even if community pops by and they don't necessarily want to paint, I always just love showing people, how fast something can get done. When you get in the zone, people are always surprised by how quickly these things get put up, right? But yeah, so you can kind of see the creative flow, kind of see how all of these sessions kind of inform the final design. And what I think is beautiful is that it's basically telling a story of this process, right? Of what we've kind of understood, how we've come to understand how we relate to one another. And it's an opportunity for community members to have their voices heard in the reflection of this process and what they want to kind of do, what they want to commit to moving forward.